Today we're looking at Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Before we begin, it'll be helpful to make a few comments about the Shakespearean sonnet form itself. Shakespeare popularized the sonnet in the late 16th century, early 17th century, wrote over 150 of them, and they are widely regarded as some of the greatest expressions in the English language. The first thing to note about the Shakespearean sonnet is that it is 14 lines, divided into 3 quatrains, 3 series of 4 lines, and a rhyming couplet indented at the end. The sonnet carries a strict rhyme scheme throughout: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then the rhyming couplet G, G. The meter of a Shakespearean sonnet is iambic pentameter. It's the preferred meter of Shakespeare's work. So if we scan the opening line, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So you see the I am, the accented second syllable, repeated for 5 feet, 5 occurrences, making it iambic pentameter. And in addition to a sort of formal organization with the 3 quatrains and the rhyming couplet, the 14 lines, Shakespeare included a sort of logical organization to the content of the poem. So the form and structure follows a rigid formula. The content tended to follow a similar system. The first 8 lines, the first 2 quatrains, presents a question, a central dilemma, a central comparison, a proposal, a statement of some kind, and expounds on that for 8 lines. At line 9 is what's called the turn, where the speaker turns from the question to the answer, or from the proposal to the suggestion, from the central statement to a complication or a response to or an extension of that statement in the final quatrain. Notice in Sonnet 18, that turn begins with the pivoting word but. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? He continues for 8 lines. At line 9, he turns and says, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. So the first 8 lines present the question, the tentative answers. At line 9, he turns, and then in the couplet, he provides a final answer, or a resolution, or a summary statement on the poem itself. 8 to 4 to 2. In the Renaissance, in which Shakespeare wrote, the sonnet form was an extremely popular form of poetry. John Donne, later in his metaphysical poems, his holy sonnets, will use the sonnet form to much success. But today we'll look at Sonnet 18, and we'll go line by line. Shakespeare's speaker here opens line 1 with a proposition, a question. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So you have a speaker speaking directly to his beloved. It's unclear whether this was a young woman or a young man. But here we have the speaker proposing something to his beloved. And what he's proposing is a treatment of her loveliness and her beauty. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Her virtues and her qualities he compares to a feature of nature. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And this reminds us of pastoral poetry, such as Marlowe uses to great effect in The Passionate Shepherd. Robert Herrick uses in To the Virgins to make much of time. This idea of nature as idyllic, nature as lovely, grand, overwhelming, and therefore he can exalt his beloved's loveliness by comparing it to a feature of nature. It also aggrandizes his beloved. It makes her seem grand, exalted, that his love for her rises above the beauty of nature in this grand way. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? He offers the question, and then he'll go on to answer it. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. The repetition of more there sets her up in an elevated state, that her loveliness and her temperance exceeds that of the natural world, a perfect summer day. And it's an odd thing to have said, thou art more lovely and more temperate. That word temperate there, meaning moderate or mild. She is not given to extremes. She's steady or consistent, constant. And this will be a theme or an idea that Shakespeare will develop in the following lines, that you are balanced, steady, constant, that you are more lovely than a summer's day, and more consistently so. In fact, he'll move at the turn to discuss her eternality. He continues, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Right? The winds of spring threaten these blooming blossoms. Rough winds shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. The time is fleeting. The Latin expression tempus fugit comes to mind. He's describing nature. The darling buds of May are shaken by the wind. Summer is all too short. Spring moves to summer, which moves to fall, which moves to winter. It is not constant. It is not consistent. It is ever given over to change, imbalance, swayed to the extremes. He continues on here at line 5. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. The eye of heaven being the sun. Sometimes it shines too hot. Often is his gold complexion dimmed. You see the contrast there. Sometimes it is too bright, too hot, and then sometimes it is too dim, too darkened. And then he makes a quite intriguing statement here. Every fair from fair sometime declines. Meaning everything of beauty will at some point diminish in its beauty. Every fair thing from its fairness will decline. Summer's lease is too short. The sun shines too hotly, or it is too dimmed. Rough winds come and shake the darling buds of May. The natural world, it seems, is not an adequate comparison for his beloved, because she is more lovely than all of these things. And she's also more temperate. She's more even, more balanced, more consistent. Every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Nature and the course it takes changes constantly. It ages, flowers wilt, summers fade, beauty wrinkles. He says every fair from fair sometime declines by chance. Something occurs, something happens out of the ordinary to make it decline, or just simply time. Nature's changing course, the movement of time. We're reminded of Andrew Marvell's poem to his coy mistress, where he says, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Time presses all of us forward. Nature, time, age is an ever-changing course. Robert Herrick in To the Virgins says, Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. That is the process of the natural world. And so here he reaches his turn. This is true of the natural world. He says, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. That somehow his beloved is exempt from nature's changing course by having a summer that is eternal. And we need to pause and consider the problem of an eternal summer. That what happens if you have all pleasure and no pain? If you have all summer and no winter, all youth and no aging, all joy and no adversity? Is that human any longer? Is that possible? Is that too idyllic? An eternal summer that shall never fade? He ascribes it to his beloved. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? It seems like he can't, because summer's days are too short, they're too hot, they change, they decline. He says, you have an eternal summer that shall not fade. Thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair that thou owest. The fairness that she owns, he says she will never lose. Even though right up here he says every fair from fair sometime declines. But here he says, not you. Thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death, right? If she has an eternal summer, then death cannot brag that thou wanderest in his shade. Right? At this turn, he's shifted his focus from nature in the first two quatrains to his love in the final quatrain. Nature is inconstant. Nature changes, goes through permutations, alters, transforms, grows. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. This reminds us of Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He says, you will not walk through the valley of the shadow of death. You will not wander in the shade of death. When, and here he sets up his couplet, when in eternal lines, there's the repeat of eternality. He's saying even the glory of heaven and earth, the sky, the sun, all of this sways to extremes, all of it changes. You have an eternal youthfulness, an eternal loveliness, an eternal summer. When in eternal lines, what are these eternal lines? To time thou growest. That as time moves, her beauty, her loveliness will only grow. It won't decline. Every fair from fair sometime declines, but here he says, you will not lose possession of that fair. Death shall not brag that thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So you see his argument here. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, then thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. So the couplet answers, the final answer, for what is meant here by these eternal lines. As time moves, your beauty will grow in eternal lines. What does he mean? So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. It would seem everything depends on what is the this. As long as men can breathe and eyes can see, as long as time is working and men are breathing and seeing, so long lives this. As long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this. And this gives life to thee. It seems the this he's referring to are the eternal lines that allow her to grow in beauty with time. So long lives this, these eternal lines, that as time goes, as men can breathe, as eyes can see, you will grow, not decline, not dim, not be cut too short, not change. It seems like the eternal lines would be the sonnet itself. That she will live in perfect youth and beauty forever in his sonnet. Because here we are, 400 plus years later, reading Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare, and what are we doing? We are collectively considering, contemplating, pondering the loveliness and the temperance and the beauty of this beloved, this person. That their beauty continues to live, continues to flourish. These lines are eternal. Because as long as men can breathe or eyes can see, then they can live and see and read this sonnet. And when they read this sonnet, these 14 lines, these eternal lines, give life to the speaker's beloved. They are reborn upon every reading of this sonnet. This gives life to thee, that even though the beloved's physical beauty has indeed dimmed and declined, the body does age. Time's winged chariot always presses at our backs toward the grave. That even though the physical body and physical beauty, physical loveliness does submit to the dictates of time, it does wither and fade and age. The speaker here says, in art, in poetry, in a sonnet, beauty and loveliness can grow, increase, and expand and enlarge. This beloved, their physical experience, their physical life might have been restricted to a town in England in the 16th, 17th century. And yet, how many people over the centuries since this sonnet has been written, how many people reading it today are considering this person's loveliness and beauty? Indeed, they have grown. Their loveliness and their beauty is now something that anyone who reads this sonnet is capable of pondering, capable of beholding, at least in the imagination. And you have to wonder if that was the speaker's point, that art preserves life. Capturing this beloved's loveliness in a sonnet is a way to defeat death, a way to defeat the grave. It's the same with a portrait or a sculpture or a photograph, that you are able to capture something and freeze it in time so that that loveliness and that beauty can endure forever, despite nature's changing course, despite the hurrying chariot of time. So the speaker's proposition, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate, takes on new meaning by the end. That the beloved's loveliness and beauty is consistent, constant, unchanging, but in a whole different way, within the lines, the eternal lines of poetry itself. As long as men can see and read this sonnet, then the beloved will endure and live and rise. And therefore the cycle of life is renewed every time. They are reborn upon every reading. If we were to put down this sonnet and pick it up again a year from now, the beloved's beauty and loveliness would still be an eternal summer that shall not fade, a fair that she will never lose possession of. She will never wander in the bragging shade of death. Because art, poetry, preserves life, creates eternity, the closest thing we have to eternity in our human world that flees and grows and fades all too quickly. the closest thing we have to creating eternal beauty this side of heaven as frail, finite creatures is to capture, distill, frame that beauty in the eternal lines of poetry.